And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Live picture there at the White House. A lot of headlines to get to out of the White House today. As you know, President Trump making an announcement at the Kennedy Center earlier this morning. Remember, he serves as the interim board chairman at the Kennedy Center, and he was announcing this year's honorees. We'll get to that. He's also fashioning his image onto the Smithsonian institution here. Fox's Rebecca Castor has more details.
President Trump's power in D.C. is undeniable this week. Under his orders, National Guard troops are patrolling the streets to help cut down on crime. And now he's lording his authority over two of the Capitol's cultural icons, the Kennedy Center and the Smithsonian.
Since I became chairman of the board at the Kennedy Center, we have completely reversed the decline of this cherished national institution. It was being run down.
Trump announced he'll be hosting the Kennedy Center Honors in December and revealed this year's honorees. They include country superstar George Strait, Rocky actor Sylvester Stallone, and the rock band Kiss. All candidates Trump personally approved.
I turned down plenty. They were too woke. I had a couple of wokesters.
The White House also announced it's launching an internal review of Smithsonian museums and exhibits to ensure they're in line with the president's vision of history, a move Democrats are calling authoritarian.
We all know that Donald Trump loves to rewrite and erase parts of history he doesn't like. It's downright Orwellian.
The White House insists this review is simply to erase any partisan narratives at the museums before hundreds of thousands of tourists visit for the 250th celebrations next year. In Washington, Rebecca Castor, Fox News.
Rebecca, thanks so much. Putting this up there from the Kennedy Center, here are all 5 of the honorees for this year. Singer Michael Crawford, also singer Gloria Gaynor, actor Sylvester Stallone, the band Kiss, and country star George Strait. So let's talk about Donald Trump's cultural impact there on the nation's capital with none other than someone who covers the White House each and every day for the Washington Examiner, Christian Datoc. He joins me. Christian, good to see you here. So a lot happening in the D.C. cultural space. President Trump really leaving a footprint in that space here. This is all part of his design ahead of America's 250th birthday, right?
It is, but he's had this idea of quote unquote beautifying, and I'm using his words directly, the district dating back to his first term in office. And this, launching of himself into the arts and trying to merge perhaps MAGA culture with mainstream pop culture has been a pet project of his for years. You mentioned the America 250 celebration, and Rebecca talked about what's happening with this review of the Smithsonian. There are some here in D.C. raising concerns that the president is acting, as an authoritarian. He is seeking to whitewash history, but the White House is simply saying, look, we're trying to make sure we put on the best, the biggest, the cleanest, speaking of cleaning up D.C., celebration of America's 250th anniversary as possible next year. And this is all part of that process. So, Andrew, it was a little bit of lightheartedness from the president, but I will say, these nominees for the Kennedy Center Honors weren't necessarily as partisan as one might have expected. There were running jokes, some bets among the press about whether or not singer Lee Greenwood would be an honoree. And clearly the president picked folks who were near and dear to his heart throughout the 70s and 80s. But these seem to be a little bit more down the middle, and certainly folks who would be deserving of these honors.
I mean, that's such a good point, kind of his personal touch on these selections today. Michael Crawford, of course, the musical theater actor and singer. I believe he starred in the original stage production of The Phantom of the Opera. A lot of songs and music from that soundtrack permeated the campaign trail, didn't it?
It did. And, Donald Trump, a creature of New York, he's loved Broadway. He's been a patron of many shows there. And I think it's no coincidence that, a former big-time success on Broadway, Les Mis, was the big opener this summer at the Kennedy Center. And it was a little bit of a surprise to hear that the president himself will be hosting this year's award ceremony. Oh. But that's just Donald Trump. I mean, he even joked about how he had hosted season finales at NBC when he was on The Apprentice, and, was kind of candid when he talked about how he had pushed to receive one of these honors himself in years past, and just decided to install himself as the chairman of the board when none of those campaigns yielded any fruit. So a little bit of tongue in cheek from Donald Trump, perhaps trying to distract from other ways that he's trying to clean up the city. But all in all, this isn't surprising based on what we've seen come out of this White House over these first 6 or 7 months of Trump's term.
Yeah, and we'll get into the federal takeover of the D.C. police force in just a moment. On the Smithsonian, though, this was an exclusive in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. Their story goes as follows, that in a letter sent to Lonnie Bunch, he's the secretary of the Smithsonian, 3 top White House officials said they want to ensure the museums present the, quote, unity, progress, and enduring values that define the American story and reflect the president's executive order calling for, quote, restoring truth and sanity to American history. Is this something President of the United States usually involves himself in, exhibits at the Smithsonian?
It isn't, to be quite frank, but again, it's not surprising coming from this administration and everything they've done to combat quote unquote woke ideology, both in schools across the country and in the public facing side here within the district. I do think there is a very real danger here that you're going to be whitewashing away some of the less savory aspects of America's 250-year past. I mean, for example, how are you going to, take out racism from exhibits honoring the civil rights struggle at the National Museum of African American History? That just seems like it's counterproductive. And, are they going to shut down the entire museum? So we do have a lot of questions, but I do want to point a finger at 2 of the officials who were on that letter, OMB Director Russ Vought and Domestic Policy Council Director Vince Haley. These are 2 of the biggest driving forces inside the White House. Vought obviously was a little bit more of a public figure, but these are the guys who are helping implement Donald Trump's social policies as it comes to practices and illustrations of permutations within the federal government. So I do think this is a sign that the White House and perhaps even Trump himself will be taking a vested interest. This isn't just lip service, something that they can throw to the base. This is something that the president is serious about and that his top lieutenants will apparently take seriously as well over the next year or so.
All right, we're focusing still on the nation's capital, the streets of D.C. I want to get your kind of personal take on this because we know now the National Guard has been dispatched, deployed there to the streets of D.C. The president posted on Truth Social just minutes ago about this. He's also indicated today that he wants to extend this time window to have federal law enforcement there. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just a portion of it. He said, Washington, D.C. has one of the highest rates of crime in the world. More than many of the most violent third world countries, the city's homicide rate is higher than places notorious for their violence, such as Mexico City, Bogota, Islamabad, Addis Ababa, almost 10 times higher than Fallujah, Iraq. He says if D.C. were a state, it would have the highest homicide rate of any state in America, saying the violent crime rate in D.C. has worsened and the murder rate has essentially doubled in just over a decade. But these are only the quote-unquote official statistics released by corrupt city officials, saying the real numbers are many times worse. Christian, you are also a creature of D.C. You live there, and in the area at least. Have you noticed an enhanced presence on the streets there of federal law enforcement?
I have, Andrew, and I'll be forthright with the audience. I was actually on vacation last week, so I missed those first several deployments of federal assets late Thursday and Friday night here in the district ahead of this big announcement Monday morning regarding the full federalization of MPD and the deployment of National Guard troops. But I mean, I'm going to be honest. I told my wife this when I was driving back from the White House. I hadn't really necessarily seen as many law enforcement officers north of the monuments and some of these hotspot areas as you might expect. But Wednesday, there were police cars, there were black federal SUVs lining my entire 20-minute drive downtown to just north of the White House. So it does seem like there will be an expanded law enforcement presence. And the White House is already touting a number of arrests. They've made more than 100 since last Thursday when these federal assets were first putting their boots on the ground. And I do want to make sure it's kind of important to note the president can legally do all of this because of DC's Home Rule Act. But his suggestion that he could expand these policies to cities like New York or Chicago, perhaps even an expanded presence in Los Angeles beyond those National Guard troops that he deployed there earlier this summer, this is a cause for concern because once you start overstepping your bounds of the federal government using, again, potentially military assets as a police force, you're subverting the sovereignty of not only these municipalities, but these states. And I do think that Democratic lawmakers have a point when they say the president is towing a very thin line right now. He's within his rights when it comes to what he's doing in Washington. But I think the rhetoric he's using, perhaps intentionally to try and get a reaction out of Democrats, I mean, I think we have to take him at his word and say, let's pump the brakes here because we're on the verge of something very different in this country.
So I have to ask, I mean, D.C. officials, how are they responding to this? When we've noted, you just noted, the president does have the latitude and the leeway and the authority to do this. That gets a little grayer if he does want to extend it. I believe he does need authorization from Congress to do that. He said he didn't necessarily need Congress's approval earlier today at this press conference. But how are they responding? Do they feel like it's needed? Are they welcoming this or are they pushing back? Is there any effort to push back on this from Mayor Bowser, Senate, House Democrats?
I would say that Mayor Bowser is perhaps receiving this the most warmly of any Democrat in the country. And she is in a unique position. We've seen her work with this administration much more closely than the Trump 1.0 White House. You can remember the tension between the president and the mayor back during the 2020 George Floyd protests. And I do think when she had her press conference on Monday responding to the president's announcement, she was not nearly as forceful in talking about how this was an overreach by the White House as some of her Democratic electorate would have liked her to see. In fact, she essentially said, look, we see this as a potential bonus. We've talked about how some of these crime hotspots across the city have been understaffed. We've identified them to a joint city federal task force in the past. And I think two things can be true. One, we can both be driving down policies that we've instituted post-COVID, I'm quoting Mayor Bowser here, while still recognizing that crime is a problem. And the mayor, I do think, had a prescient point when she said, we want to be mindful of how we are policing our communities. We want to engage in good community policing practices, but really, ultimately, no amount of crime is acceptable. And she's going to do everything she can to work with the federal government to make sure that DC is a clean and a safe place to not only live and work, but for tourists to come visit and take part in, the national treasures our capital has to offer.
Yeah, Christian, while we have you, just lastly, want to leave D.C. briefly. We do have a live picture there. Take a look at this. This is in Anchorage, Alaska, outside Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, where we now know the summit between President Trump and Vladimir Putin will take place on Friday. Christian, do you have any reporting to suggest how President Trump is preparing for this summit?
Well, the strategy, it seems to be shifting, if not hour by hour, day by day ahead of this meeting with President Putin, Andrew. And the reason I say that is because Donald Trump himself seems to be shifting what he expects to get out of this. When the meeting was first announced a few days ago, he suggested this might lead to an immediate ceasefire in the war. But now the president, having spoken to us on multiple days this week, it sounds more like he is trying to sit down with Putin, have a one-on-one closed-door meeting so he can get a read on whether or not the Russian president is purely feeding him lip service when it comes to ending the war, or if he's serious about a ceasefire. The president said, essentially, we need to lower our expectations. This meeting should be a table setter for another meeting between Presidents Zelensky and Putin, and potentially Donald Trump, if they invite him to tag along as a third. And he told European leaders on a big NATO conference call Wednesday, again, afternoon, 2 days before this meeting, that he would not make any guarantees to Russia about land swaps with Ukraine without a Ukrainian party in the room. That's a big line for the Ukrainians. And basically the feeling after that conference call from our European allies was one of jubilation. They think Donald Trump is on their side of this issue heading into the meeting with Putin. But a lot can happen in 2 days in Donald Trump's White House. So we're going to have to, monitor this thing over the next 48 hours to see if there are any twists or turns that might shift the president's thinking ahead of Alaska.
Yeah, I mean, Christian, just lastly, other than the location and the day, don't have many details on how this is all going to go.
We don't. We've been told it's a one-on-one meeting, again, between President Trump and President Putin. We don't know if there will be interpreters in the room. Obviously, there is somewhat of a language barrier, even though Vladimir Putin does speak passable English, even if he doesn't like to show it off in public very often.
Yeah.
So there are so many questions. And again, we'll have more reporting on this over the next 48 hours, Andrew. But I think those around the world are watching this just as closely as you and I are.
All right, Christian Datoc, as always, great stuff. Good to see you. Talk soon.
Take care, Andrew.
Okay, in the meantime here, back to D.C. crime. I want to finish out reading the rest of that post on Truth Social. Going to pick up where I left off. Trump saying this on the issue of crime. Saying, in fact, a precinct commander was just suspended for allegedly manipulating the violent crime statistics. And the D.C. Police Union likewise says the real numbers are much higher, saying because the Democrat government of D.C. has largely stopped investigating, arresting, and prosecuting most crime, the published statistics don't even capture a fraction of the actual violence. He follows on to say no one is arrested for shoplifting. Citizens living in fear have largely given up on calling the police, instead choosing not to walk the streets after dark, essentially becoming captive prisoners in their own city. Stores lock up their merchandise behind glass walls. Gang youth violence is so common, it goes largely unreported. Vehicle theft in D.C. is more than 3 times the national average, saying schools are completely dysfunctional. Citizens are afraid to speak up or call the police lest they be targeted. The real crime rates are probably 5 to 10 times what has been reported, saying D.C. has been under siege from thugs and killers. But now, D.C. is under federal control, where it belongs, saying the White House is in charge. The military and our police will liberate the city, scrape away the filth, and make it safe, clean, habitable, and beautiful once more. Fox News correspondent David Spun with more on this.
I haven't heard from one detective. Not from my husband, not from my son. Not one detective.
For Asia Tamimi, crime in the nation's capital is personal. Her husband killed in a stabbing 4 years ago. Her 3 sons have been the victims of gun violence and survived. She calls the federal takeover of the D.C. Police Department necessary.
If I was out driving, I would feel a little bit more at ease, like I'm not going to be carjacked or something like that. Yeah. And I think a lot of the people feel safer.
Tonight, members of the D.C. National Guard will once again hit the streets, much like they did last night, but with even larger numbers. An Army official tells Fox News more than 400 members are in the city ready to deploy. President Trump today teasing an extension to the Justice Department's 30-day arrangement running the city police department. The D.C. Home Rule Act calls on Congress to approve any extension past 30 days.
Well, if it's a national emergency, we can do it without Congress, but we expect to be to Congress before Congress very quickly.
Thank you for what you do.
Fox News was there exclusively last night as Attorney General Pam Bondi met with federal agents before they patrolled the city.
Thank God for all of you and for what you're doing for D.C., for our country and our world by keeping us safe.
D.C. police referred Fox News to the White House press office for updates on statistics. There, officials claim 43 arrests overnight, including 7 illegal firearms seized. Critics insist the takeover has gone too far.
Our National Guards are not trained for this, and we know the missions that they are trained for, and municipal policing is not one of them.
Leaders in other big cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Los Angeles also watching the D.C. model closely. In Washington, David Spun, Fox News.